We know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to a revamped podcast with shorter episodes that focus on 3 areas that I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and we'll be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory, and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. So grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. So today I'm joined by Dr Claire Plumbly, founder of Plum Psychology, who provides burnout recovery for busy professionals who can't afford to collapse. I love that. Welcome, Claire. Give us a heads up on who you are and what it is that you actually do.
Yeah, hi Lisa. Thanks for having me. So I'm Dr. Claire Plumbly, like you said, and all the things that you've just said. I help people try and recover. We offer intensives for people who intensive therapy for people who can't carve out weekly therapy time, but might be able to carve out, say, a week. So these kinds of things really help people in leadership roles who tend to be completely back-to-back crashing from one thing to another. My recent baby, which is how we kind of got on each other's radar, was my book. So I've written a book called Burnout: How to Manage Your Nervous System Before It Manages You. And that supports people it brings all the therapy resources and knowledge that I use in my trauma training about how the nervous system works and how chronic stress completely just squeezes us and makes it really hard for us to bounce back, in the same way that I was teaching to my trauma clients. And so I put all of that information in a book, which is available in paperback and also audio for anyone who's listening to a podcast thinking, when would I ever read a book, but does have capacity to maybe download an audiobook. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a taste of what I do.
Perfect. And today we are exploring burnout because I think it's something that every leader needs to know about, whether it's about themselves or leading other people. So, question for you, Claire, is when you talk about burnout in your work, what do people often misunderstand about it?
I think one of the things is that they refer to sometimes burnout as being the big crash. They're talking about clinical burnout, like I'm having a mental breakdown and fearing that. Yes, that is burnout. That is the severe end of it. And you don't want to be getting to that. Obviously, we don't. But it's helpful to know that actually it's on a continuum, and you can be having functional burnout where you're hitting all the markers of burnout, which we can talk about in a minute, and still pushing through. So yeah, to think of burnout as on a continuum might be helpful.
That's helpful actually, because I think I see what you just described in terms of people think about this like crashing out, and also the fact that it doesn't ever happen to me. It always happens to other
Yes,
people.
exactly. You do also see a lot of people kind of spending a lot of time like, am I burnt out? I don't know if is this a pity party? Like kind of putting themselves down as like not coping or being broken. If you're in that place where you're questioning it a lot, that is a red flag that you are probably experiencing burnout or somewhere on that stress continuum, and you need tending to.
Yeah.
So you don't need a professional to come along and say, yes, tick, you hit all the markers. Just start listening to your body.
Yeah, good advice. So let's unpack what's really going on beneath the surface by clarifying what burnout really is and challenging some of the assumptions which you're already kind of beginning to think about. So when people are experiencing burnout, what's happening for them psychologically, physiologically?
Yeah, okay. So people in burnout have kind of gone through the natural response to too many stressors. And so what that means is, your body switches gear from being in its kind of rest and digest mode into sympathetic nervous system mode, which is when everything gears up for quick responses. So your heart it starts to beat faster, your whole body responds in a way that's set up for fight or flight.
Mm,
And that's okay in short bursts. You do concentrate a bit better, your immunity does go up, but our body wasn't designed to be in that for a long time. And so what we find in modern day life is that those stressors never stop. There's always something you go and be getting on with. There's
Mm,
also quite a short feedback loop because you'll get something done off your to-do list, you'll hit send, and then somebody responds immediately, and then you've got something else on your to-do list. So what happens, we've got all these kind of stresses coming in and it's relentless. We get trapped in stress. Our body can slip into the next place, which is more of a shutdown place.
mm,
So that's what I talk about in my book about these three parts of your nervous system and how that shutdown place is all about, curling into a ball so you don't keep getting hit by all these incoming stresses. So we get heavy, we feel demotivated, we start to feel cynical and detached from the things
mm.
that used to light us up, the projects that used to light us up. If you're in a caring kind of role where caring about what you do is really important, which is most roles, that passion and care just drops out of what you're doing. And that can
Mm.
feel really disorientating and upsetting in itself because it can be a big part of your identity and your role. Um, and you stop feeling like you're any good at your job. You stop feeling like you're accomplished. And that's on top of all the signs that everybody tends to recognize, like
Yeah, so
feeling
what I can say,
exhausted and stressed.
what are some of the early warning signs then? So if someone was, because like you said that some people have thought about burnout as being kind of when someone
Mm,
crashes. So thinking about continuum, what would be the sort of signs that people might recognize in themselves or other people around them that perhaps this person
yeah.
to experience it?
So, as a psychologist, we tend to split that into four areas, thinking about the body, the physiology. So, that would be, if you're getting more colds, if you're struggling to recover from illness, if you're getting stress coming out in your muscle groups, so some people get headaches, migraines, tension in their backache, displaced pain, sometimes that is. Um, Eczema flaring up. What are your physiological signs? I get cold sores. I start getting them all over the place. Do you have any
Yeah.
signs of stress in your
Oh yeah,
body?
I can feel myself getting really tense, like literally my
Yeah.
muscles, I hold my muscles much too tight.
So your body's talking to you. So if
Yeah.
that is getting more intense and frequent and you're kind of finding it hard to kind of come back from any
Mm,
illnesses, that's one sign. Cognitively, we tend to get very fixated on problems. It's a stress reaction. So where our thoughts go in that like sympathetic nervous system is very rigid on problem solving. Everything tends to feel worse than it is. We struggle to see the wood for the trees and that there might be people out there who could help us or might have answers. We tend to get quite doomful about change being possible. We might get escapism thoughts, but that can feel impossible as well. So rather than escapism thoughts being like, oh, I need 2 weeks in Mallorca, they might be like, I wish I could break my leg and nobody would come and I could be in hospital for 2 weeks and nobody could come and get me with
mm,
my to-do list. So what have we done? We have body, cognitive, emotions would be overwhelm. But you're just like your repertoire of emotions becomes reduced. So rather than having access to all the full emotions of happiness and joy and content and calm and all of those, it's kind of like you've just got all the negative ones and you're just oscillating between overwhelmed, low, irritable, snappy. So if you're snapping at people and you're kind of thinking, hang on a minute, they just asked me to do something that's actually quite reasonable. Your
mm.
bandwidth is obviously much lower, so that's a red flag. And then the last one is behaviors. This is the last in your quadrant. And your behaviors are going to be anything that helps you cope with all of that nastiness that I've just gone through. Usually it's about escaping the moment. So we start to
Mm.
do the kind of quick release kind of valve behaviors, going and drinking an extra glass or two of wine in the evening because it helps your brain to stop shouting at you or narrating everything that you've got to do. It might be doom scrolling or buying things you don't need or, all these kind of
Mm.
things. So if you recognize any of those four are dialed up and kind of making your quality of life not good, on top of those other things I said, where you're exhausted, you're detached, and you're not feeling good about yourself or your job, these are burnout kind of red flags.
Yeah, and I think high performers often miss those signs because they're
Mm,
still appearing to be successful, because they're still
yeah,
delivering results. And so they feel I see people on that kind of almost that treadmill of like, well, I'm still achieving what I need to achieve. And other people around them see that and they are recognizing that, rewarding that what appears to be success at kind of regardless of what costs. And it almost
yeah.
masks what's happening underneath in order for that output to happen, which I think is a real concern. And I see quite a lot happening in teams, unfortunately. Um, so having some awareness, and you've just described these four areas brilliantly, is really critical, but having awareness alone doesn't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really interested to sort of think about what leaders can do in terms of having a positive impact on well-being, because often there's this, again, an assumption that burnout just comes from having too much workload,
Yeah,
and the reality is we know that that isn't something that is true. There's a lot more at play. So if we think about the leader's role in all this, um, and leaders are often supporting other people while they're running on empty,
I know.
and that's a huge concern. What does sustainable self-care really look like, Claire?
I mean, I just think the fact you've got a listener who is a leader and is taking this time to think about this stuff through your podcast right now is really good. So I just
Mm,
want to say well done to anyone who's just taken this
mm,
time. And so, yeah, getting to know yourself and what pushes your buttons so you can start to kind of regulate yourself, because like you say, leaders have got to a certain point quite often because they've been good at kind of putting their foot on the gas and keeping going, so you might not be good at noticing those signs. So self-care does mean checking in with yourself. What do I need right now? Compassionate decision making. So I talk about to my clients about, okay, so when a request comes in and you're looking at your calendar thinking quite often, how I'm going to squeeze this in. That's just like a default setting. Like
mm,
an alternative question could be, how can I get to the end of the day feeling like I'm, okay, and I'm still enjoying my job? And so learning where the boundaries are that you need,
mm,
and maybe meetings, putting in meetings to start at 10 past the hour rather than on the hour, like little things like this, so you can have compassionate pauses in your day. So I talk a lot about these micro moments where you stop an activity, that transition time between activities. That's
mm,
the point at which you do have a gap, and it might not feel like you have a gap, but there is a gap there, and it's
mm,
just making it a tiny bit longer than it was before, so that you can, like right now we're talking and I'm getting excited and I'm holding a lot of tension in my shoulders. So right now I'm just noticing that because I'm talking. So I
mm.
might choose in the middle of the meeting or at the end, like I say, to transition into the next thing by doing some stretches.
Yeah.
Um, it's
I,
just so that you don't reach the end of the day kind
yeah.
of completely spent.
I think what you've described is I kind of think of it as almost like a rhythm. I think too often people get stuck on thinking about outputs. And actually when we focus a bit more on the rhythm we have during the day, which is
Yeah.
that ability to sort of pause, reflect, um, think about how I'm feeling, how I'm showing up, and actually then to kind of tweak and adjust that as you go through, that makes all the difference. And I like the way you just described that in terms of transitions. So what in terms of organizational factors or cultural factors do you think keep burnout either kind of hidden or perhaps just normalized?
I think that kind of sending emails in the middle of the night. I got up the other day and lots of people emailed me on one thread. It was a lawyer and it was a psychiatrist. Lots of people on one thread had all emailed in the middle of the night. So I think we're normalizing
Yeah.
working through our rest. It's that hero culture, isn't it? And like that feeling like I'm proving my present, that I'm present by being physically present all the time or available all the time. So
Mm,
it's modeling what what actually having a rhythm could look like that's really
mm,
healthy for good deep work. So practicing that, like actually, we've got a mutual contact called Natalie who does some of our back end support, and she's modeled to me having a day where she talks about her out of office literally says today is a day of deep focus, so I'm not attending to emails. So if you email her on that day, you get that response. And I've started to use that. So it's like that's she modeled that to me, and I've taken that on board, and now hopefully I'm modeling it to others. I worked with a trainee a while ago in a busy business. She didn't have any language for setting boundaries for herself until she overheard a senior who was asked to do something, and she heard him say, "What's the time frame in this? Can it be done next week?" Um, you know, she just didn't have any words until that was modeled to her. So I think leaders and organizations just letting people see and hear that, is really important.
Mm. And I think what you've just described in terms of those boundaries and it's always the little things, people,
Mm,
that's the stuff that makes up a culture of an organization. And people talk about culture a lot. And actually, when you kind of drill down into that, we need to think about, well, I talk a lot about clarity, about kind of being really clear about what it is that matters most and real connection between people, that sense of feeling safe and having that sense of belonging
mm,
and the control. So being able to have those boundaries, and it's about how they show up. So and that's all through what we say and what we do and how we interact with each other. And that's the people often don't think about that in terms of burnout. They often think about burnout as just my ability to deal with whatever's on
yeah,
my
yeah.
on my in tray or my on my desk. And actually, there's a whole lot more there. That's much more around the environment that we're in and how we engage with each other. So really interesting. Um, so you've talked a little bit about boundaries. We've talked a little bit about how we about compassion and self-care. So I want to think a bit more about what sort of practical change looks like. So that gets down to some sort of practical aspects. So if a leader in a team was suspecting that someone was burning out, wherever they are on that continuum, what would you recommend would be the first steps that that leader should take?
I mean, hopefully already built in our regular check-ins and one-to-ones. So I definitely think, it's putting that immediately in the diary so that you're having space and using any skills that you've got in really creating spaciousness for that kind of meeting, because someone won't feel psychologically safe enough to say that it's difficult. I sometimes when I give talks about burnout, I give an image of a cat hiding because when an animal is bruised or wounded, it will go and hide because it doesn't want to be seen as the weak one in the pack because that could spell disaster for it, could be outcast. So that
Mm,
will be going on as someone's psychology, that if you're kind of saying, what's going on. So just to hold that in mind, it might not feel safe. You might not be the person to be having that conversation. It's like thinking, who is the person that feels safe? Do you have the structure in place like mental health first aiders and wellbeing support? But trying to also make sure you don't get to that point, like having the regular check-ins, like you say, so that it can be caught. There is research that's worthwhile, like looking at around the six common stressors that lead to burnout. So making sure those are all kind of managed. And like you said, lack of community is one of them, lack of fairness, making sure people are being sufficiently rewarded or showing gratitude for their work. Um, sorry, I've moved into preventative. You're saying what do they do if they do suspect it? I think it's making sure you're having a conversation and supporting people to have like here is the next thing you can do, being really clear,
yeah.
um, making sure people have booked leave because I find now work for myself. When I first transitioned to that, I would forget about booking my leave, and when I worked in the NHS, I had my team around me saying, "When's your next leave, Claire?" So making sure your staff have their next like leave booked in, they know when it is, and they don't get to that place where they can't take it.
Mm. I think your what you're saying about the one-to-ones, I mean the one-to-ones do not happen enough.
Yeah,
In the majority of organizations I go into because people don't have time to do it. Or if they have time to do them, it's very structured around how are you performing. It's almost like what's the
right.
output.
Yeah.
And there isn't enough time. One thing I bang on about quite a lot is around having a space that's about genuine care and
Mm,
curiosity
mm,
and having a genuine interest in this person, how they're doing. And if something's not going as well as it could, just being very curious about what could make or help make that a little bit better, that experience better
yeah.
and how to support. And I think when we take it back to essentially being human, rather than, right, this is a job to do on my, I've got to have this one-to-one, I've got 20 minutes to bang through that before my next one. It just changes that, the literally just changes the feeling of how someone is showing up and what they're experiencing in that one-to-one. I think you were touching on prevention, but I think that's a really important point that it would be worth you talking a little bit more about those six common stresses because
Mm,
again, when ultimately we want leaders, managers to be to recognize when people are having very early warning signs that there's burnout
Mm.
potentially happening. Ideally, we don't want people to be in that place at all. So, you were touching on some of the things
Yeah.
around kind of community and so on. And I talk a lot about basic emotional needs, that if people's needs are met, and that is definitely a part of a community, that sense of belonging and recognition and sense of status and feeling good about what you do. And there's all
Mm.
sorts of things. Just tell us briefly what those six stresses are, and so that managers and
Okay.
leaders again can think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you can see someone struggling, it can be hard to know, is this something going on outside of work or not? So I think thinking about the
Totally.
context, and that's always what I'm saying to my clients, that's how you might differentiate burnout with something else, is thinking about what's going on. So the three I mentioned already was lack of community, which you've said about psychological safety and teamwork and nurturing that space so that you can feel
Mm,
connected. Lack of fairness. So if there's things happening where, some people are being treated differently to others, that can be hard to take kind of notice, can't it? But, making sure people are getting their needs met fairly, there's no discrimination,
mm,
because that burns people out. Insufficient rewards is, not being shown the level of gratitude or appreciation that we just need to do our job. Because I think there's an idea that you show gratitude maybe for the big stuff rather than the everyday stuff. So kind of see it as like that lubricant that keeps the cogs going, little and often. Especially if someone's in a job where gratitude isn't shown by, say, the customers. Like the police that I talked about earlier, they are classic. They're not being shown gratitude by the people when they're on the beat. So, having staff come back and say, "Oh, I was really grateful when you did that, or you did that so nicely," is lovely. Um, Conflict in values. So, if you're asking someone to do something that doesn't align with their values, that's going to be
mm,
really difficult. And the sharp end of that is moral injury, where people could be really quite traumatized by that. The example I often give is when I worked in the NHS and I was asked to go from seeing 15 clients a week to 25. And the way I was asked to do that was to see people for fewer sessions, for shorter amount of time. Um, and also the peer supervisions, the meetings with my peers was removed from my diaries as a regular thing, just one-to-one supervisions, which meant I had less community and less time to think about my
mm.
clients. So I didn't feel like I was doing the nice guideline kind of therapy I've been taught to do. So this massively misaligned with my values. So it's the same with sales, it's the same with targets, like thinking about how that might be and how to support people to find a way to feel aligned with their values in the work they're
Mm.
doing. And then lack of control. So if someone's being micromanaged, making sure people have some control somewhere about where they start in the task, or, what measurements are being taken, or how often, just thinking about if someone's being, managed to the nth degree, they're going to feel like there's no wiggle room. That's too much. And then the last one, the sixth one, is the one we always go to first and just assume it's all about workload.
Yeah.
High workload, not enough resources. Yes, that's important. But think of this on the back. There's a jobs demands balance model with a pair of scales. If you have some of those needs met, people can cope with some of these difficult parts of their job. But if they're all flatlining, that's a recipe for burnout.
Yeah, and I think what you running through those six areas, I think, are really key, because I think they highlight very clearly the need for leaders and managers to be developed in terms of how they lead people. Because, a classic is seeing people micromanage or be so absent because they don't know how to fulfill their role, what's needed of them,
Mm,
that they don't provide the right thing, they're too close or they're too distant. And there's a big space there around actually helping managers and leaders know how to show up in terms of what's needed of them by the people that they're leading. And the other side, the other part of that is around the team development. And I spend so
mm,
much of my time, which I is the bit I love doing, is working with teams about how they function as a team. So what
mm,
is it that is, how do they engage with each other? How do they support each other? How do they look out for each other? How do they allocate different responsibilities? And there's there's a
mm,
whole there's a huge area there, like you give the example of you being in the NHS, that when stuff's taken away from you in terms of your opportunity to meet with peers and talk about how things are going, and have that, you had supervision, but this might be more of an informal way of doing it in a workplace. actually having an opportunity to think about how are we doing and how are we engaging with each other
Mm,
to be able to show up, feel good about what we're doing, be successful in what we're doing, and do it as a collective. And I think if people spent a bit more time on that space, it would go a long way to reducing burnout, which people tend to think about as an individual issue. And actually, it comes back
yeah.
to
Yeah.
let's look at the bigger picture.
I mean, physiologically, because we were touching on the nervous system earlier,
Mm,
so it's helpful to know that, one of the ways we regulate our nervous system, which you need to think clearly and do your work and not burn out,
mm,
is through co-regulation, which is when our nervous systems regulate with other
mm, mm,
um, regulated nervous systems. The opposite of that is co-escalation. So if everybody's kind of just bulldozing through their day in that kind of sixth gear, we're not kind of getting any opportunities to rest and reset, and we're just going to keep setting each other off because, I'll respond to an email in that kind of high
mm.
octane way and expect quick responses, and it becomes this vicious cycle. Um, yeah, and sorry, I know we probably have to move on to the next thing, but just to say with the team stuff, sometimes interventions don't look like interventions. I think that's kind of what you were alluding
Couldn't
to
agree
as
more.
well. And so an example of that is, working with a team who were trying to do like a mindfulness at the start of a team meeting. And that was just too intense for a lot of people and it felt too awkward. So we just talked about, well, what did they enjoy? They enjoyed having a cup of tea and some biscuits and just spending the first 15 minutes catching up and
Mm.
just chatting about their dogs or about their whatever the weekends. And I was like, that's not skiving. That's in therapy call them problem-free talk. There's a lot happening there that's really important because you're connecting, you're hearing, and you're feeling valued and seen. And so, that's an intervention.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think you're right to label, well, to actually talk about the labels around interventions. And actually, too often people want to grasp something that they can say, we are now doing this thing, like
Yeah,
mindfulness. Whereas actually, they're missing the essence of what they're trying to achieve from it,
yeah.
which often we can achieve through without having what people think of as a traditional type of intervention. And that's about tweaking practice to essentially change the behaviors, regardless of
Mm.
what we're calling it. Um, okay, so this all leads to kind of quite a big question, which is about how do we define success? Because when we're thinking about, for a lot of companies, they reward people working flat out to produce high results. And that can be an expense of individual health and well-being. So I guess there's a question here about how do we redefine high performance without glorifying people overworking?
I think self-worth has become woven into productivity. So I think it's separating that out that actually your self-worth is bigger than just how much you've produced in one day.
Mm.
I think that's why, for example, when I went on maternity leave and I wasn't producing things every day other than keeping my baby alive, I was like, I don't know how to do this. My self-worth kind of went down, and my husband would come in at the end of the day. I'd be like, I did all these to-do lists. And he's like, okay, but you don't
Yeah.
need to do all of that stuff. It's fine. So I think separating out that you are enough, and the ability to have that rounded life where you've still got hobbies, you're still maintaining really, your relationships because those are buffers to stress, but they're also about why you're doing the work. So coming back to your why, those are your values, and we don't live to work.
Mm.
We should work to live. I suddenly
Yeah.
thought, am I saying that the right
I was
way
just
around? And that those messages about our worth are kind of narratives out there that are very hard to separate ourselves out from. But just knowing that's a narrative that's coming from all those pressures, and unfortunately, certain voices in certain governments, perpetuate all of that. And the way it's talked about very high up, it presses down on targets, it presses down on the fact that we are short-staffed. So you making a choice about a project and when you're going to turn off for the night and things like that, that is you taking a little stand against that. So get buddies, get compassionate accountability buddies who feel the same. So you can
Mm.
do it together and you can kind of stand up for each other and celebrate when you say no. Because I do that
Absolutely.
sometimes. Psychology's a bit better at that, maybe. Not brilliant, but they get it when I'm like, yay, I said no to something instead of thinking, Oh, that was selfish. They're going,
Yeah.
yes, go you.
Yeah. And that all comes from or highlights the importance of leaders doing this because leaders are role modeling and they will be they need to role model what sustainable performance is about, which is about not pushing at all costs and being able to step back and think about what it is to be human. And so having all your boundaries and having a life outside of work, other activities and so on. So yeah, that needs to be your colleagues kind of supporting each other, but definitely leaders role modeling that for sure. So
Mm.
what, very quickly, what would be one mindset shift that you think could change everything about burnout?
I think it's instead of asking yourself, how can I do more? How can I make more space to be more productive? It's about how can I feel safe enough to pause, because I think that's really hard for people to be able to do that. You're never going to get to the end of your to-do list. So waiting to the end of your to-do list before you take a break or nurture those things that I've just said are really important. That's not the way to do it. But we have that all wrong, and we tend to think I can get to the end of the to-do list and do all those lovely things.
Yeah, I like that, and I think that ties in with what we talked about in terms of well, also the leaders role modeling, being able to have just written down about rest and reflect. So that ability to during the day just pause. If I said to someone to rest, they might go, I haven't got time to do that, but just pause and just reflect on where you're at, for how you're showing up, how people around you are, what you've achieved, what you're moving on to, and you've described that brilliantly throughout this conversation. So I leave the listeners with one thing to act on. And so I've got a question for you, which is what's one thing you wish every leader understood about burnout?
So I think there's a misconception that we will be able to switch off once we are tired enough. But actually, that's not how our nervous system works. And that's why so many people struggle to take their lunch break or to switch off at the end of the day. And they crash into bedtime with their phones and their laptops up there. It's not about switching off when we're tired, it's about switching off when we feel safe enough. So I talk to my clients about no, it's not an on-off switch like a light switch, it's like the gears on a car. Your nervous system has been in sixth gear all day. So you need to kind of think about when you come off a motorway, you wouldn't come into like a residential street, just like immediately put the brake on. You've got all that energy and the fuel needs to kind of burn itself out. You have to come down gradually. So
Mm,
thinking about how can I transition into a place where I can take a rest, I can take a pause. As the kind of, it's not just adrenaline, it's the dopamine, it's all of those kind of motivational hormones that keep us going through the day, and they give us a buzz as well. They feel
mm.
good. So that's not, you're going to get a bit of a crash. You're not going to kind of just get it dissipate. It feels good. You're going to have to feel a bit clunky going down, but to know that with practice that gets a little easier.
Love that. And I love the fact you've got a car to demonstrate that. That was brilliant. Thank you for running around and grabbing that before we hit record. Um, so I guess we need to think, or what I would like leaders to or listeners to think about is um, what they can do differently. So, any listeners, whether you're a leader or a manager or anyone else, about how you show up differently, knowing that what you do has an impact on the people around you. And so, I would really urge people who are listening to think about, spend 5 minutes thinking about change starts with individuals and about
Mm,
what we can do to better think about ourselves and also the people around us that we might be leading in some capacity, even if it's
yeah,
about being a parent and leading our children
yeah.
and role modeling and so on.
Mm.
Um, so I'd like to say, I mean, time is up. Half an hour goes so quickly. I'm struggling to make my podcast shorter than the hour they always used to be. But I want to say to all the listeners, thank you so much for listening today. I want to say, Claire, thank you so much for joining me because you are a font of knowledge. I love speaking to other psychologists because there is so much I want to kind of contribute and add to and explain and explore more with you. But obviously we're time limited. But it's something I see time and time again. The real results, the real impact of burnout, and it's not good. And people often my sort of leaving comment would be that actually people are often very good at masking it. And you will, I'm sure, see this as well in your one-to-one work. When I'm doing coaching with people and having one-to-one sessions, that's when the mask comes off. And the number of people I've sort of worked with at very senior levels, MDs and so on, who are literally in tears in a session because they are barely, well, they're not holding it together, but no one else around them in their teams know about it. So it's about making sure we are keeping ourselves and other people around us as safe as possible through all the good advice that you've shared with us today. So all the resources will be in show notes, including reference to Claire's book and Claire's contact details and so on. So thank you once again for joining me today, Claire.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates with your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but sometimes find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. If you're listening to this in autumn 2025, then keep them peeled for my brand spanking new website that's coming soon. Be sure to check it out. It's timeforchange.co.uk to find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join my mailing list to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my new retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to the next episode coming soon. Join me then.